Hello, I'm Emma-Louise Coffey, and you're welcome to the Dairy Edge, the Teagasc Dairy podcast. We're bringing you the latest information, insights and opinion to improve dairy farm performance. As our attention turns to the busiest time of the year, with one eye on the upcoming calving season of 2022, we look to simple work practices and technologies that will save us time come spring. Labour researchers Marion, Beecher and Conor Hogan quantify what tasks will have the biggest impact on your workload. And I first asked Marion why farmers are striving to improve labour efficiency.
From research, farmers are actually putting an increased emphasis on their own work-life balance. So farmers themselves are wanting to spend more time with family or do other things outside of farming and use farming as a means to an end. So I suppose that's one aspect. I suppose the other aspect is actually, there's a challenge in terms of finding workers at the moment. So the availability of workers has led to an increase in the interest in terms of improving labour efficiency. But there's also other aspects such as, by improving labour efficiency, it's not all about necessarily about, saving time in certain instances, but it's about making the work more enjoyable and more easier. And if that happens, then it's likely to be done better. And I suppose the knock-on benefits of that is that it actually, increases profits, or it makes it easier to attract people to work on your farm. And then I suppose overall, on the grand scheme of things, it comes back to money. And actually, by improving your labour efficiency, you can reduce your costs and increase profits.
And if we consider, it's not that far away from the 1st of February, hard to believe as the year is flying by, but, February is just around the corner, and by and large, farmers will start calving cows around the 1st of February. If we consider that, February calving time and into the onset of the breeding, looking at spring summertime, how much of our workload is compacted into that 5-month period?
Yeah, so I suppose that for first seasonal calving based systems, as you described there, Emma-Louise, research has shown that for the spring and summer periods combined, it counts for 57% of the total annual work. And of that 57%, almost a third of that, 32%, occurs in that springtime, so in that February, March and April period, and then 25% over the summer. So it's a huge chunk of the annual workload on seasonal calving systems that goes into that, first 6 months of the year effectively.
And Conor, you would have looked at this time frame on a study that you've carried out with dairy farmers across the country. Can you give us some information about the farms you would have studied?
Yeah, so on the back of what Marion said, Emma-Louise, we did a study from February to June in 2019, basically looking to measure labour input on farms. And 82 farms took part in this study, and they basically recorded their time input once a week on a different day each week for that time frame. So basically the aim of that study was to basically capture and benchmark labour input on farms in that period. And we would have found that farms were working about, it ended up that it was 18.2 hours per cow for that period from February to June for an average herd size of about 137 cows. So significant time input was going in during that period.
And that 18.2 hours per cow, is that fairly standard, Conor, with what we would have seen in previous work carried out on labour measurement, or where does it rank?
So relative to say Justine Deming's study, which would have been in say 2015 and 16, but that focused on, I suppose, specifically labour efficient farms. But our study would have found that farmers were working more hours per cow for this period. Her average was about 21 or 22 hours per cow for the full year, whereas ours found they were working 18.2 for just this time frame. So it was significantly more for the period, but a different and a more representative sample of farmers in this study.
And looking then specifically, you measured labour input on these farms. I suppose, could you categorise what type of tasks you identified farmers doing and where, I suppose, was the majority of their time spent?
So we divided basically on this smartphone app on which farmers were recording there was 10 separate tasks. So what we found was milking was the most time consuming task, as you'd expect. That was just over 30% of time. And this was followed by calf care at 14%, grassland management at 13%, cow care then, and repairs and maintenance both at 10%. They were the 5 most time consuming tasks on farm.
And what level of work practices and technologies from a labour efficiency perspective did you observe on those farms, Conor?
So as part of the study, Emma-Louise, we assessed what work practice and technology implementation was being put in on these farms. And of the farms, we basically found that there was 59 work practices and technologies that were related to labour efficiency. So basically each farm then was given a score based on this. So where you implemented best practice for labour efficiency for a given work practice or technology, you were allocated a point or one score. So what we found was that on average, farms implemented 30 work practices and technologies out of the 59, so just over 50% of them. And basically, there was a large range, once again, like all things related to labour efficiency, there was a large range in implementation of these work practices and technologies. So it highlights that, I suppose, there's room to improve on many farms, and that there's large potential gains regarding labour efficiency to do with the work practices and technologies.
And Conor, we would often hear, larger herds tend to be more labour efficient. Is that something that you would have observed within this study?
That's something that we saw, Emma-Louise. And it was also something that we saw with the work practice and technology implementation, that larger farms were implementing more practices and technologies than smaller farms. And it's likely to be part of the reason why they're more labour efficient.
So just on that point, Emma-Louise, what we've seen and what Conor has seen and what you tally up with previous research is that herd size isn't a barrier to being labour efficient. And we've seen a huge range within herd size categories as well. So in smaller farms, we've seen that they can be equally as efficient as some of the larger farms. And there's huge variation regardless of herd size out on farm. And I suppose that's the same with everything in terms of, grassland management. We've seen some farms can grow, 15 or 16 tons of grass, and others are struggling with, 8 or 9 tons of grass in the year. So there is huge variation within herd sizes, as well as increasing herd size.
And it's interesting. It's a really good point you make, Marion. And while the trend is, as you increase the number of cows, there is increased efficiency, but there's, regardless of herd size, there's a huge range in terms of what people are achieving. And to you, Conor, if we consider the springtime, and every year I would say the biggest learning that I would get in terms of saving time and improving labour efficiency would be once a day milking in the month of February. You've identified 59 tasks across the spring and summer. So let's talk through some of those. What are the practices and technologies that you would have investigated that you would see easiest to implement on farm?
So Emma-Louise, there's a huge amount of practices and technologies available to us to improve labour efficiency, but I suppose it is important to focus on the ones that are easiest to implement. And there's lots of work organisation practices that should be relatively straightforward to implement, yet there isn't yet uptake of them isn't fully across the board isn't overly high with some of the practices. Like some of these would include leaving the milking pit to feed calves during milking is still being done on many farms, and having to herd cows into the parlour for each row of cows is another one. Feeding calves with buckets, or there's plenty of mechanical techniques to draw milk, so we should be looking to avoid buckets and that sort of stuff, and limiting kind of manual work as well, stuff like hand scraping and that. And like these tasks should be relatively easy to implement, and they should also have benefits not only for labour efficiency but also as regards manual work and limiting how much manual work we'll have to be doing on farm because there's enough of it.
And talk through then the amount of time farmers will save as a result of implementing some of these practices or technologies?
So we of the 59 practices and technologies, then like we basically estimated the time that could be saved through 12 key work practices and technologies, which are across the 4 most time-consuming tasks. So for milking, we found that say having one person in the milking pit for mid-lactation, and that's obviously depending a lot on your parlour size and everything else to do with that. So that saved about 3 hours per cow. ACRs were seen to save about 2.5 hours per cow. Not leaving the pit to feed calves during milking was seen to save minus 1.3 hours per cow. And having the ability to operate exit gates from anywhere in the pit was 0.9 hours per cow. And then herding cows in and out mechanically, so basically on a quad or in a farm jeep, or that was 0.9 hours per cow again. So large savings there through some relatively straightforward practices and around milking. So similarly, then there was a couple for calf care as well. So basically, contract rearing was seen to save about 0.8 hours per cow. Automatic or ad-lib calf feeders, about 0.7 hours per cow. Not rearing bull calves on the farm, so selling bull calves was seen to save about 0.7 hours per cow again, and training calves on group feeders from days 1 to 4 as opposed to individual pens was seen to save about half an hour per cow as well. And finally then, for grassland management, we were looking at a saving of 1.8 hours per cow for contracting out slurry spreading for the spring, which can be a huge time saving for that task. And there was 2, I suppose, simple, relatively straightforward practices for around cow care, and they involved basically no hand scraping taking place on the farm, which would save about 0.5 hours per cow, and cleaning dry cow cubicles once a day, which was 0.5 hours per cow again. So there's a large range of practices in Emma-Louise that can save us time, and that's I suppose a sample of the most prominent ones that we found.
A huge amount of information there, Conor, and I think just to pick up on 1 or 2 tasks that you're talking about in relation to milking, as you say, it totally depends on the parlour size. If you're in a 40-unit parlour, it's 2 people operating that particular parlour. But there's a lot of scenarios where you start in the springtime. There is a requirement for 2 operators in the parlour, and then it just becomes a habit, and 2 people continue to work in the parlour for each milking. That's a saving you mentioned of 3 hours per cow, where there's 1 operator mid-season. And if we think about that across a 100 cow herd, that's 300 hours. And, if that second operator is a paid employee, even at minimum wage, that really adds up. And the reality is we're paying more than minimum wage at this stage on farms. The huge amount of tasks that you mentioned. I'll come back then to another task in the spring, and it might be related to, scraping cubicles once a day. But, from, I suppose, a cow health perspective and from a feed cost perspective, there's often a push where conditions allow to get cows out from calving, so in and around the 1st of February. Could you quantify the time saving, Conor, if you get cows out to grass compared with if you kept them in the shed and you were feeding them silage and scraping and liming cubicles twice a day?
Well, we don't have an actual figure for that, Emma-Louise, but having cows out early, say having cows out full time before the 14th of February, that was seen to be that was associated with labour efficiency. It was one of the 59 practices that we found. So that by doing that, it definitely is a time saving on farms.
And Conor, you mentioned that where farmers are contracting out their slurry, it has a huge time saving of 1.8 hours per cow. The use of the contractor is something we often talk about for the spring, but potentially underutilised on farms. What tasks would you see farmers could engage with the contracting out work during the busy time?
Yeah, so slurry was obviously a hugely important one, Emma-Louise. And there's also the spreading of soil water and fertilizer by the contractor at that time of year. They were also shown to be labour efficient practices as well. And like on the contractors, there's also huge potential there as regards potentially, say, feeding. Contract rearing calves, it was another one that is a labour efficient practice. And there's also contracting out any repairs and maintenance work on the farm to specialist people where possible. It's going to save time on the farm, so should be definitely considered.
And some of the practices and technologies that Conor has mentioned, involve automation or, investment in facilities, which invariably have a financial cost. With the exception of labour, what should farmers consider when they're completing, say, a cost-benefit analysis in considering one of these technologies?
Yeah, that's a fair point. I suppose many of the tasks, many of the things that Conor has identified are very little cost, but there are obviously ones that do incur a higher cost. And I suppose it's up to each individual farmer to weigh it up for his and her individual situation. And I suppose the first thing to look at is actually what task is that job or automation or technology going to do. And it should be focus on one of the most time-consuming tasks, ideally, so either milking or calf care. And I suppose you have to consider, the overall cost of the technology or practice that you're implementing. But I suppose then it's important to look at the benefits of that technology. And I suppose looking at the indirect benefits of, what would be the cost if that job wasn't done properly or correctly? So example, over milking. So if you over milk cows, you're more susceptible to mastitis, and what's the cost of that? That could be, antibiotic tubes, or it could also be the time actually in treating sick cows as well. And then I suppose you have to look, as it was, that's tied in with the time saved. So again, you were talking, Emma-Louise, about the paying staff on an hourly basis. And actually, if you can implement a technology that will automate or partially automate a process, well, then you're going to save in terms of your time or staff time. And again, it goes back to making the job easier. So it might, if it's making the job easier, it's going to be done better. And again, there's positive impacts based on that. And I suppose that it's up to each individual farmer to weigh up the value of the technology to him or herself, and also the importance of the job that they're looking to automate out.
And finally then, Marion, I mentioned calving season is just around the corner. And if we consider the conversation that we've had today, could you give us some of your top tips that farmers can ensure that they minimise the labour demand that they experience in the spring of 2022?
Yeah, so I suppose it basically goes back to a few simple things, Emma-Louise. It goes back to having facilities, practices, technology, and people management right on farms. So with that in mind, I think it's important to, I suppose, plan your spring. So that means prepare your facilities, prevent and prioritize tasks. So spending time now on things like vaccinating cows to prevent scour, or spending some time in repairs and maintenance so that your scrapers or certain machinery don't break down during the middle of spring can help. So L then in terms of labour force, so ensuring you have enough people available, including contractors, to manage the workload. So A then would be about taking action, so implementing the practices and technologies that some of the ones that Conor has identified or that are specific for your own farm, particularly I suppose in terms of the two most time-consuming tasks, which would be milking and calving. And then I suppose lastly, so N, which would be like the number of enterprises, so reducing the number of groups of stock on your farm. So maybe selling the unproductive animals, having a plan to either contract rear your calves or getting rid of your bull calves as soon as legally possible, and matching your stock numbers to your facilities.
I think there's been some really interesting tips throughout this conversation, and in particular as you step down through some of the practices, Conor, and actually identifying how much time that is saving farms that ye have measured in reality. A lot of the practices have little or no cost, so making these changes are actually free. And from what you have highlighted at the start, Marion, massive positive impact in terms of the labour demand, how attractive your farm is as a workplace, and then taking a lot of that manual labour out of the farm, which has huge benefits in terms of health and safety. Thank you, Marion, and thank you, Conor.
Thanks, Emma-Louise.
Thanks, Emma-Louise.
That's it for this week's episode of the Dairy Edge podcast, and my thanks to Conor Hogan and Marion Beecher for joining me on this week's show. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe to the podcast. You can listen on Apple and Google Podcasts as well as Spotify. And for more information, go to the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie. I'm Emma-Louise Coffey, and join me next time for your Dairy Edge.